I would like to thank everyone for tuning into this podcast episode, where we will be interviewing Ric Lewis. He was a founding partner of Tristan Capital Partners, a leading UK-based real estate investment firm, and who had previously founded Curzon Global Partners. He is also a noted and celebrated philanthropist as the chairman and founder of the Black Heart Foundation, which supports a diverse range of community initiatives to improve the educational outcomes for disadvantaged young people, and which provides extensive scholarship and mentorship support. The Black Heart Foundation is also his connection to the University of Chicago, as one of the senior partners at Tristan is a University of Chicago alum, and the two organizations have worked together. So his organization, the Black Heart Foundation, and our own Odyssey Scholarship Program. For over 15 years, the Odyssey Scholarship Program has provided enhanced academic, social, and career support to students who are from lower income families or the first in their families to attend college. Ric, well, first of all, thank you so much for joining this podcast. Because I would like to focus on your professional experiences, personal journey, and philanthropic efforts since moving to the UK, I think it would just be useful if you could just sort of describe the professional context for your decision to relocate to the UK.
Sure. I mean, before I start that, I want to say that this is particularly resonant with me because I was the first in my entire extended family to attend university. So the work that the Odyssey program does, that my foundation does, comes from the very deep personal understanding of sort of where intervention at the right moment can change the vector and slope of someone's life, because it changed mine. And that's what I'm trying to do and what the Odyssey program is trying to do. But yeah, I grew up outside of Boston, attended Dartmouth College. I majored in economics and Spanish, worked in banking for a while, then moved into real estate private equity. Went from an analyst to a partner at a US-based firm called AEW Capital Management, which is still a prolific real estate private equity firm in the U.S., wrote the business plan to help expand our business outside of North America. And my other partner said, okay, smart guy, this is a good plan. Are you going? And I was like, ooh, didn't see that coming. So in 1998, I moved over to London, what I thought would be 2 or 3 years. Now, 25 years later, this is my life. I feel like I'm at least on my third life. And I say that because, you know, my prior life in sort of college and playing basketball at a pretty high level, and my U.S. business experience, and now over in Europe, where I really feel like this is home. It's where my 2 daughters were born. They grew up and went to primary and secondary school here. They go to university in the States. So that, you know, we know both systems really well. We move back and forth. We have 2 passports, but I understand both cultures really well. And it's been really informative in the work I do, both at Tristan and with the Black Heart Foundation.
Diving into a little bit of sort of the professional context of that decision, that period when you moved over to the UK, I think must have been a very interesting one, because not only were you sort of starting up a sort of an offshoot of AEW, namely Curzon Global Partners, but sort of shortly thereafter you were, if I understand correctly, you set up the Black Heart Foundation. And so I guess sort of looking at the professional context first, was this, I guess, to kind of situate our listeners, sort of late 1990s, was this part of sort of a wider trend of the globalization of real estate investment, and how much sort of when you were thinking about that move was your firm sort of adjusting to wider trends, and how much in terms of your professional experience were you sort of starting from scratch in terms of developing a template for this kind of international move?
I think a little bit of both. So AEW back then was a real pioneer. The first commingled real estate fund, it seems like hard to believe that there was actually a first one and it was that recent, was a fund that AEW put together in the late 80s that actually owned the Sears Tower for, you know, people that live and breathe around Chicago. And so I remember walking the roof of the Sears Tower, you know, as I was one of the asset managers to look after the asset up high there and keep myself chained in so I didn't blow off the top. But that's another story. In the mid-90s, U.S. firms were starting to invest globally, and they were starting to invest in Europe. But if you really looked at it, it was an agglomeration of maybe 12 to 15 markets that were still focused on their domestic market, and they weren't pan-European. When I was doing the study about kind of moving along the trend, we had been educating clients about markets outside of North America and taking them on visits and trips and studies for a while in anticipation of taking our business globally. I did a study and I looked at Asia, Latin America, and Europe. And if you remember, 1998 was effectively the birth and the rollout of the euro currency. So my underlying assumption, not just mine, but the one that I, conveyed to my partners, is that the birth of the euro in a single currency was going to mean that previously domestic-focused investors were going to need to be pan-European, or at least outside of their country. They're going to need to cross borders and invest across the entire market area. And I couldn't see, turned out to be right, I couldn't see a network of pan-European investment managers that could service and help that flow of capital. We weren't the only one. Morgan Stanley was there, Goldman Sachs, the old Whitehall funds, et cetera. They were investing in multiple countries, but it was really the birth of sort of pan-European real estate, private equity funds, commingled funds, and investing. Prior to that, a lot of the business was done by agents and super agents that would say, I know somebody, I've got a building, do you want to buy it? You're a German insurance company, I can play you into the UK. But it wasn't professionally managed. It wasn't managed with co-investment capital. I can remember talking to my clients in Europe, my very first clients, and saying, I'm creating a fund. I want to invest alongside you. I'm going to put in capital that's at risk when you're in. They're like, no, you can't put capital in my partnership. I'm like, I promise you want me to lose when you lose and win when you win and not have any separation of sort of incentives. But it was such a new concept. They're like, no, you're the service provider. You don't get to put money with my money. I'm like, no, actually, I promise you want an alignment of interest. So it was really the birth of that. And the business grew substantially. AEW's business, which in Europe, we named Curzon Global Partners, went from 0 assets in 1998 to 18 billion in 2008. I mean, I would like to think that was just pure genius on my part, but it was catching the cycle right and the need for the market and actually using the U.S. playbook. Things that I had learned growing up in the U.S. It wasn't like I was writing new rules or had new alchemy. It was actually doing the things that we did very successfully for major institutional clients in the U.S. and bringing that to Europe. Again, I'm not trying to take credit. We weren't the only ones. There's a lot of other very successful managers that were doing the same, but we were in the flow and we definitely benefited from it. And our clients did too.
Yeah, and I think you sort of touch on something really interesting, and I'm sure sort of dive into it in different ways, but the interesting cultural explorations that happen when you're engaged in a cross-border move like that, and then also their familiarity with sort of the partnership model and moving from that and giving a different market sort of your insights and the insights of the market that you came from, and then I'm sure we'll explore a bit the insights that you've gleaned from working over obviously an incredibly extended period of time in the European market. I think sort of focusing a little bit initially personally, obviously living abroad pushes you outside of your comfort zone. Can you give any examples where you were aware of this happening and how you dealt with these and what you learned from these?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, just the way from little to the absurd. I mean, in the U.S., if you're in Boston, you walk into a bank, you open a bank account, you get your card in your bank account that day. When I was here in the U.K., it took 6 to 8 weeks. You're trying to give them money to deposit in their bank. Not even last for a loan. And literally the background checks and the whole process would take 8 weeks. Since then, there's been intervention by other banks that say we have to cut this down and make this more user-friendly. But there was a very, forgive me, pedantic approach to we'll tell you the rules on which you can do business with us. You're like, but I'm trying to give you money and you don't seem to want to take it. And that would be the case sometimes with service providers too. They're like, I'd really like you to come by and do something on Tuesday. I'm like, I could come on Friday. Are you really busy? No, but Friday's the day that I'll see you. Really funny. I'm trying to pay you a lot of money to do something. So there was market things like that. I think that there was a lot of cultural bias when I first got here. People were like, oh, so you're a Yank. I'm like, yes. They're like, oh, really? Fantastic. And would you like some biscuits? Would you like some tea? And it was sort of like they were kind of asking, so when will you be going back? I was like, are you having a nice visit?
You showed them in terms of sticking it out.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. So you come back a couple of years later and they're like, so how are you doing? I'm like, well, we have 5 million under management. They're like, what? Because it was that they believe that, it used to be, and again, this is a little bit outdated. I mean, there's still vestiges of this, but the phrases that I really couldn't get my head around because of my American upbringing is what one ought to do. Or that isn't done, or I couldn't be bothered. I'm like, you can't be bothered to be successful or ask for business or be kind or be polite. And that's probably taking it too far because there's plenty of kind and polite people here. But there was just you grow up in a culture which is, well, one is supposed to do that and one is not supposed to do that. And it'd be like, well, call me a rebel because I'm not from this culture, but why wouldn't you do it this way? Couldn't we be more successful, more profitable? And create a win-win situation. And then eventually people would go like, yeah, I'll take a chance on that.
And I think that's really interesting. And essentially, I think, sort of kind of, I guess, distilling or expanding out those personal experiences to perhaps a wider point is that I think capital markets sort of were ahead of other areas in terms of globalization. But this is sort of still the late 90s. And as you say, like this was very much a new set of interactions. Would you say that in terms of kind of the way global capital markets have, the culture around global capital markets, have they essentially adopted the U.S. approach because capital markets are, as the name suggests on the tin, they're about capitalism, and the U.S. had a more unfettered version of that? Would that be sort of a fair generalization?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think there's two things that have gone on that have changed things. I mean, the nature of cycles, because of how capital markets are truly global and how money speeds around the world to the best opportunities and crushes the worst ones. What used to take 10 years takes 5, 5 takes 3, 3 takes 1, and 1 is tomorrow. So it used to be slow capital markets movement. You'd see it, you'd read about it in the paper. Now it's instantaneous. So people realize, like, sticking by my old rules and hiding behind the fact that it's going to take a long time, I'll just lose. So that's part of it. I still think that there are differences in cultures. I mean, for example, the U.S. way of doing business is, straightforward, more clinical sometimes, more analytical, fast-moving, etc. But at its worst can be obnoxiously insensitive to sort of, what's going on there, the cultural norms, etc. I mean, it's gotten a lot better, but it still matters. Like, we operate in 20 countries, and it's different in every country. What we do in France is different. What we do in Spain, what we do in Italy, etc. I still believe, when I first got here, I used to say to people, like, it's really easy. The U.S. is about basis points, and Europe's about relationships, right? Like, it doesn't mean that the people in Europe didn't care about getting a deal done, but like who they were doing business with, whether you actually sat down, had a meal, had a glass of wine, you knew people, you made some kind of cultural connection for them to trust you with their gold, their relationships mattered. With the U.S., it was a best idea. There's a blend of that now, but I think both still matter. And I think that why I like to think I've been successful and, my team and company has been, is that I think we do both. And I think some of that comes from my cultural background. Like, I've always been at some level, even though I went to the schools that everyone valued and was from Boston and, from money center city and from the Northeast, I was an outsider. Like, I'm a 6'10" black guy from, I wasn't a natural insider. I was the first in my extended family to go. So I've learned how to read those situations, and I think they call it in psychology code switch. You don't lose your identity, but you understand, like, how do I get someone who's very different from me to be comfortable with me? What are those nonverbal ways that you start building relationship? I think I have the American background, which can be built sometimes on individualism, exceptionalism, meritocracy, moving, productivity, but at the same time I can culturally switch to being somebody's friend, in Italy, my fratello, what's going on, come stai? There's partners I had that would be like, I haven't seen you in a while. Mama asked you, when are you coming home? Like, I haven't seen her in 5 years, and she asks about you all the time. Like, this is a commercial deal in Milan. But he's going, no, you became part of our family, and you have to say hi now.
And I think that's really interesting. And I think considering the blend between relationships and business, and then, as you're talking about, kind of the slightly different versions of capitalism and considerations of sort of capitalism's wider context, I think is actually a really interesting segue into some of the philanthropic work that you do. And I think, just to sort of put it in context again, you moved over, I believe it was in 99, and then there was so much that was happening for you all at once, and you started the Black Heart Foundation shortly thereafter. How long had you been thinking about establishing something along the lines of the foundation? And was there anything about your move to the UK that shaped the vision of the organization?
Yeah, probably. I had been doing the work mainly as a mentor, volunteer, board member, even in the States. I had been part of the Boys and Girls Club of America and of Boston, the I Have a Dream program, the Big Brother program. So I was finding a way to give back, because I realized that, like, while my family was great and a great influence, I didn't get to where I was without the help of other people that were well-meaning. And I always wanted to find a way from a very early age, from the beginning of my professional career, to do something that was similar to that. When I moved over to the UK, I thought, well, I want to continue this. And so first I got on sort of the broadest ones, which was the Prince's Trust and Teach First, which was a very small organization that grew up to be one of the largest charitable organizations in the UK. But I felt like that was good. And then Teach First was exceptional, but some of the others were like people trying to build status in the UK. I don't want to besmirch Prince's Trust, but there were some people that were doing it because they really loved the work, and some people that wanted to be important to the powers that be and maybe get some letters after their name, et cetera. And I thought it wasn't just for me. So I thought, I want to do something more grassroots. And so I started to look for organizations that were small that I could help. At the same time, I was trying to think, how do I think about my own personal philanthropy? I mean, I wasn't as well off or have as many resources as I do now, but I was trying to think like, well, how do I do this in a cost-effective way? And I had a eureka moment that like setting up your own foundation isn't hard. You just have to file the documents, have a lawyer, have an accountant, et cetera. When I was growing up, I thought, foundations, like those are big, complicated things. And I realized it's not that hard. You just have to do the work. So I did it. And then I did it also. I had the foresight to create it in the US and the UK so that if anyone wanted to contribute alongside me, that they could do it with me. So it's a 501c3 in the US and it's a registered charity in the UK. But it allowed me, even on a small basis, to gift on a U.S. tax advantage basis, but also help the local community. And that was really how I started. But when I started to do that, I realized the huge need. Again, I want to be kind, but also direct. When I first got here, it felt like the U.S., like in mixed communities, and the idea of philanthropy and helping out the under-resourced, under-chosen, underrepresented felt like the U.S. in the 70s. It felt like just or just the beginning of affirmative action in the U.S., like people were going, this might be a good idea to help some other people. When I first got here, all of the things that I went to fundraisers were either about animals or lifeboats.
I can understand the animals, the lifeboats.
Like ending fox hunting and the dogs and the cats.
Yeah, I can get all that, but obviously not to exclusion of others. And then the lifeboats is, Yeah,
the RNLI, this is one of the biggest charities in the UK, like the lifeboats and saving people off the water. And I would say, well, but what about the children? And I mean, this is a little bit of a joke, but it actually happened. Someone would say, well, they're at boarding school, love. What do you mean?
they're all taken care of.
No, not your children, like the children that aren't at boarding school. Now, I'm happy to say, and it's not because just we were focused on it, it has changed, and people are thinking about social inclusion and educational inclusion and business inclusion. It ain't where it needs to be, but it's so much better than it was. But I just saw a huge gap. So I started trying to figure out how could I marshal resources in addition to my own to provide resources, sometimes in kind, but monetary resources to organizations that would encourage, support, mentor, etc. Kind of get some of the stuff that I got along the way because I happen to be in the Northeast. It happened to be enlightened, happened to be post-60s affirmative action. I know that like I was a good student and I might have deserved a bunch of things, but it wouldn't have happened if I had lived in a different place, a different time, etc. So I started doing that, and then that grew to being interesting and fun, and to some board positions I took on. And then in 2013, I decided we just need to start actually giving money and creating scholarships. So we created the first Black Heart Scholars in 2013 with the idea that we would do 3 a year, pick 3 deserving students that had got in somewhere and gap fund the difference between what it cost and what they could afford. And somehow, in a really lovely way, part other people's support, part my advanced giving, we now have 620 scholars at 160 schools.
That's absolutely incredible. What that experience, I imagine, gave you is something different than a lot of expats in the UK. I think especially American expats. I mean, a phenomenon I've observed is that you'll have people who work in a very sort of, obviously they live in London. London's very cosmopolitan. They work at a firm, and all this is fantastic. They work at a firm that is very sort of international and cosmopolitan, and then they vacation outside of the UK because obviously sort of the weather's nicer and any number of reasons. And that's all sort of very understandable and valuable in its own terms. But I think what a lot of people miss is an understanding of the place that they live in. And I imagine when you were setting up the Black Heart Foundation, certainly I imagine within London, you were targeting communities or you were setting up an ecosystem to support communities which exist outside of that. And then presumably you also have a wider sort of regional and national focus. So what did that experience practically, how did you go about building your partnerships and your relationships with kind of existing organizations and in different parts of the country? And then in terms of your perceptions and understanding of the country, how has that experience shaped it?
Yeah, so at first, we had 10 years of having relationships with community organizations that were providing pastoral care, encouragement, support, mentoring, etc. So when we started the Scholars, 3 isn't hard to fill, but we got the word out to everyone we were already helping and saying, look, why don't you send the best people that have need to us, because effectively we're giving away free money. Now it took like 3 years because people go like, no one gives away free money. And by the way, like every little bit that people do, if you're at corporate and you're just doing some volunteering or you're doing something and you feel like you're not emotionally involved, but you're doing the work, it all matters. It all matters. And it's fantastic. So I don't want anyone that thinks like, oh my God, I should be doing something, but I'm not doing it, to stop doing it. But the value that when you get there and you realize that you've changed the vector and slope of someone's life, I used to say, like, I don't know if I'm Santa Claus or God, but like, it feels so good. Like you actually see, the recipient of your scholarship, like crying because they can't believe that someone that they didn't know and outside of their family wants to help them accomplish their dreams. Then their mother's crying. And then you go to a couple of these meetings. I'm like, it's Tuesday. I'm not crying today. So it becomes rewarding to yourself, but there's so much need out there. The systems that we used to have in the U.S. that help people. You see all the stuff right now, the Biden administration trying to figure out their financial aid package. Universities, because I'm the board of my university and one here too, trying to figure out how do we provide those resources to people, because the federal government that used to do it when I was young has said we're out of that business, even at the loan. So there's a whole group of potentially disenfranchised people that have talent, have grit, have done all the work. The applications we see, they've overcome great odds. Single parent family, 5 kids, 2 rooms, but got straight A's and A stars in high school and get a place in Cambridge and going, I can't figure out how to afford it. So we first went through the groups that we were working with, and they would refer in potential scholarship candidates. At the same time, we had our website up, and in our social media presence, we basically, in a respectful way, said we're giving away free money. So the combination of the external groups, the community groups, the people that were recipients telling their friends, like, oh my God, I just found someone that's giving away free money. The ripple effect starts to happen where at first we would have 3 and we'd have 50 applications. Now we do somewhere between 50 and 100 scholarships a year, and we have upwards of 5,000 or 6,000 applications for those 100 scholarships. So it's harder to do. But even though we're at 600 and we'll probably get to 750 this year, it's the tip of the iceberg. Literally, we could do 10,000 in the UK.
I think that gets to sort of an interesting question because, working in charitable sector now for over 2 decades, you've obviously looked at the way in which the current resources as channeled through public policy and all that, the limitations. And obviously, as you say, 750 is the tip of a massive iceberg. Has, over the course of those 20 years, have your views on, specific public policy programs or the appropriate level of resourcing for them, have they changed? Presumably more governmental resourcing in many areas is the answer, but in some cases it might not be. And so how have you thought about the relationship between, civil society engagement and the charitable sector kind of versus public policy?
Yeah, so I'm focused on the private market and private relationships, because my relationship with the government and my stance is I will talk to anyone, and anyone that is aligned or an ally with what we're trying to do, I'll partner, I'll talk about, I'll share all of our information. But just like everything, and this isn't particular to the UK, it's just political. It changes by administration. They gear up to do something. They don't get it done. Yeah. They're suspectful of everything. My organization, we cover 100% of all overhead costs. So every penny that's ever donated, either I probably personally contribute 80% of everything we give away or more. But anyone that contributes anything to us, whether it's a corporate partner or a personal partner, every penny goes in the scholarship. So everything from our swag to our overhead to our employees to our accounting costs. So it's 100% pass through. There's nothing to worry about and you can audit all this stuff. But everyone just thinks why would you do that? I'm not sure I'll trust it. So you just get stuck in people thinking, oh, like, well, should it be you or whatever? And I'm like, I don't have time to convince them that this great idea that is working is a great idea, if they aren't positioned to do that.
That's a nice segue into a cultural observation that I've had. And there's pros and cons to both, which is that I think the idea that I definitely think in sort of American culture, there is the concept of redefinition, both, I guess, individually, and then also kind of redefining the parameters of what's been done in terms of, let's say, in this case, the charitable sector or in business or whatever, is obviously deeply, deeply ingrained. And in the European context, and obviously this is painting with an incredibly broad brush, it's much more kind of situated. And there are pros and cons to both. And I think one of the pros of a situated approach is that at the personal level, you're probably a bit more focused on relationships. You obviously mentioned that remains a big part of European focus on business and all that, but then that can obviously be limiting in terms of imagination. And so I think that's a kind of a good segue to talk about your mentorship, and then also perhaps some of the wider lessons and also cultural lessons you might have learned from that in terms of mentoring kids both in the US and UK. And in other interviews, you've mentioned that a key part of mentorship is acknowledging that the struggle is real. So conveying to kids that basically hard work is going to be a huge component, whatever you're trying to do, wherever you begin from. If you're trying to accomplish something, it's going to be a huge amount of hard work. Obviously, if you're coming from a disadvantaged background, that's going to be even more so. From your perspective, is the struggle similar for underprivileged kids from the US and UK, or are there differences? And how do certain sort of policies and cultural attitudes essentially shape that struggle for kids on either side of the Atlantic?
Yeah. So I think the struggle is real in both parts. And what I try to tell the young people is like, look, it is hard. Work by definition is hard. Otherwise it would be a holiday. You'd feel like you're on the beach of the Caribbean. So like, you just have to understand that like that grind and that feeling of pressure and whatever, it's unfortunate, but it's real and you have to normalize that. I think that the differences between the two countries is that there is more structural support in the U.S. It's different than it was. There's less than there was a few years ago and many years ago. But I think that there's still the attitude of meritocracy when people find young people that have talent. They're like, oh, I want to back this person. I mean, you can see it in sports. You can see it in education, et cetera. We're here in the UK. I'm not saying that there isn't exceptions. There's plenty of exceptions. Otherwise, my foundation, the stuff we do wouldn't be up, active, successful, as well as many other things. But sometimes there's a little bit of like, your place. How are you trying to get ahead of the pack? Is that right? Is it too bold? Is it too brash? Is it too individual, etc.? There's other sides of that. I mean, one of the things that I think the UK and Europe do much better than the US. The US is about exceptionalism and individualism and meritocracy and moving forward. And where do you rate and how do you get higher? Where the UK and Europe, and again, generalization here, works better in teams. Like they actually think like we could all do this together. And you see that sometimes in sports, whether it's the Ryder Cup or football or whatever, but you also see it in business. It's just like, I might not be comfortable putting myself out to be the absolute head and drive through this. Again, for anyone listening, definitely hard driving, no problem. I'm going to lead by example in every single industry and everything. But there's a bunch of people that are still asking permission to exceed and succeed here. And that is both an impediment to productivity, impediment to creativity. It's also a huge advantage to those people that go, I can still be polite, respectful, diplomatic, but absolutely want to exceed and succeed, and I'm going to do everything I can. I feel like that's how we got successful. It's that I don't think you'll find anyone that thinks I'm rude or obnoxious or whatever, but like at the same time, we've been unapologetic about like doing stuff that we thought would make change or grow, or that's been true of the business and the foundation. We did things that, whether it was like hosting customers for a social engagement or running a charity golf tournament, people go like, well, that's not how you do it. But then everyone wanted to come to ours because we're like, no, it's going to be more fun, more prizes, so you could go like, oh my God, this is just big and American. But you give people the private choice, like, I'm coming to yours. Yeah. I like gifts and fun and stuff too.
My view is that gifts and fun probably do translate across cultures.
They do, but I think people would think like, that's not how you run that. That's not what we would do. And then over time, we had a lot of pride. A lot of times when we first started Curzon, our unofficial motto was wrecking the industry one investor at a time. It was like, we don't have to do things the same way everyone else has done it. We have to be respectful. We can't be too brash. You have to still I mean, we're in a trust business and we're a fiduciary. So you have to stay in the model that is still where trust and fiduciary, relationships live and thrive. But at the same time, we don't have to do it the same way that they've done it for the last 500 years. And it's okay. And I think we've been rebels. Like my proudest moments, and I think it's starting to happen a little bit with the foundation, but it was with Tristan, is that when people would go, expletive Tristan, like, why didn't I think of that? Like, that's like, like, I love the fact that they're going, oh, I wish I had thought of that. It's so simple. And like now everyone's at their party, their conference, at their gathering. And when you figure that out, that that's how you build community, we've just transferred that to the foundation. When you do things and people feel like they're fun, it's for a good cause, and they look around the room and go, these are the people I want to be around too. It's a win-win-win.
Basically, in terms of how it shapes your view of mentorship, I mean, is it the idea that despite sort of cultural instincts, everyone is kind of self-actuating, everyone has within them certain sort of goals, and mentorship is about channeling them towards that goals. And likewise, everybody on some level needs other people to do it and needs a wider community. And so kind of the point of emphasis might be slightly different with UK or European kids because of that slightly culturally different perspective being more collective oriented. And in the US, you might emphasize different things. Would that be sort of a fair characterization of the differing?
The difference is, whether you're in the US or the UK is trying to figure out like, well, the same thing. Everyone's, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You want to feel like you're safe, included, there's love, there's growth, and all of those things are true. But what the blocks are very different based on where you grew up and what the cultural norms were. And that's not just the UK. I mean, I'll give you an example in the UK. So if you live 20 years from the UK, 25 years in the UK, and you're Pakistani or Indian or Nigerian or Ghanaian or whatever, 25 years later, you're still that, but you're a UK citizen as well. You do that in the US, you're Ghanaian American, you're Nigerian American, you're American first with a Nigerian culture. Like there's just a difference, and it's just the way it's oriented. So you can always feel like you're an outsider, even though you're like, wait a minute, I'm my third generation that I'm here, but somehow because it's Europe, because there's many countries, because of all the history, the difference is still recognized. And so you have to unpack sometimes in mentorship, like how is that weighing on what you believe you deserve and you can do and you can aspire to, where we've unlearned some of that in the US. That don't mean that there isn't a ton of cultural prejudice that still exists in the US, but there's also beside it a meritocracy where you're like, oh, right, Bill Gates didn't go to university, he's a billionaire. Elon Musk didn't go to university, the billionaire. Like there's models that says, doesn't matter if you went to the right schools, had the right family, if you have a good idea and you push for it. I'm not espousing any of those as the model, but there's plenty of examples. I mean,
and I've prompted these big generalizations, but I think sort of the U.S., you're less fettered by history in the U.S. because it's a younger country and it's a country that was, so I mean, de Tocqueville talks about this and all that. I mean, the kind of reinvention has sort of, even though it's a couple hundred years old, reinvention was sort of baked into it culturally.
We're here to do it a different way. I'm reminded all the time this is going too far because I'm not flying the big American flag. Like both of my daughters were born here. They think that they're British first and American second until like the World Cup or the Olympics. I'm like, oh, you like to win gold medals. But yeah, there is this notion that one has to ask permission to succeed. And that is baked into a little bit of the culture here. And it is changing in so many places. And it feels really fortunate to be here as it's changing. The kind of people we mentor, like the fact that they would fall to tears because they can't believe that someone that they didn't know outside of the family would want to help. Like, I think that has become more normal now. But when we started 15 or 20 years ago, like, no, this doesn't happen.
I guess kind of building on some of what we're discussing about kind of mentorship as being a way of sort of channeling the goals and values or helping people identify their goals and values and then helping them kind of execute them. I would like to discuss a chapter of your career which provides, to me, an excellent example of how sticking to your values and sense of purpose ultimately led to the best outcome, despite the fact that it didn't seem so at the time. Perhaps you could discuss the circumstances of how Tristan Capital Partners was founded. And my understanding is you had to make a difficult decision to kind of leave your previous firm and which was based on kind of being committed to a particular vision that you had.
Yeah, I had a particular vision, and we had, effectively the parent company in the U.S. and its parent or parent sold itself to a collection of French entities, which is now Natixis Bank. And there were some cultural benefits because it was much more European then, but there were some cultural challenges. And I just realized that this isn't the culture I wanted. I felt like it was valuing sort of control and organization over success, and I didn't think that's what our clients wanted either. So I ended up saying, look, I'm going to leave. I'm going to just take my leave. I'd been doing it for a bunch of years. I was over here longer than I thought I was. I wasn't moving back because this is what was home for me. I'd take some time off and do something different. And the clients were like, well, that's really interesting. We're coming with you. And I'm like, no, but I don't have a plan to start my own business. And they're like, well, you should work on one right now. They went into, back then, AW, where I was a partner, and said to them, like, look, Ric's leaving there. AW had asked me to stay an extra year while we jointly found a new chief executive and chairman for the business. I did, and that's when we went in to tell the clients. They're like, no, this is great. So he's going to continue to manage some of the funds while he starts up his own business, because we want him to stay active on where the money that he raised from us. And effectively, in a great, kind but direct way, they were saying to AW, you will do this, so we won't give you any money in your other businesses. So we were involved, and it was like an 80-20 deal. My new little fledgling company was 20% of the economics and the promote and the funds. But as we started doing the work, clients were like, actually, you guys are doing all the work. So it flipped to like 2/3 us, 1/3 them. And I don't remember where it ended up, maybe 80-20 the other way. And I had a agreed non-poaching for the senior team for 2 years and all the rest of the team for a year. And I didn't really expect I was going to raid them, but as soon as that went over, a bunch of people jumped over the fence. So a lot of my partners have been my partners for 20 plus years, because and my clients have been with me for the core of our client base. Some of them go back to, the late 90s.
Wow. Yeah. Obviously, Tristan Capital has gone from strength to strength since then. And I think it'd be very interesting to get your insights on some wider issues from the perspective of, obviously a founder partner of a leading real estate investment firm. So as an outsider to it, presumably the profitability of real estate investments has a correlation with the overall economic success of the communities in which that real estate is situated. And so it'd be interesting to get any views you might have about the ways in which a community's real estate profile informs wider commercial prosperity. Or I guess another way, is there anything policymakers or urban planners could learn from your perspective in terms of what makes real estate valuable and improve it as an asset class sort of across a city or country?
Yeah, I'll go another step. So where we feel most comfortable investing are the places that we can make investments that it is open and amenable to us improving the local quality of real estate so it's attractive both to tenants that will pay more for it and institutions that will pay, or that feels like it changed the risk profile, that they'll pay a higher price to sort of invest in that and buy it from us. For local policymakers, the key to us as institutions, and I think this is just beyond real estate private equity, is doing the things in your community that attract, retain, and encourage institutional foreign capital to be a constant investor in your locale, whether it's city, market, environment, countries. Because I want to invest in Poland, and it's great that local institutions want to invest in Poland, or reasonable ones, but I know the market's always going to be best for me when there's local, regional, and international that are interested in Poland because what's going on in the economy, the rule of law, the receptiveness, tax and fiscal receptiveness to outside capital coming in, not like opening the doors to the raiders, just being a place where you can make a fair return and get it in and out with your money. You tend to want to go there in and out more often. And that's better for the economy because more people are working, more things are getting built, more things are getting improved, and it becomes an institutional place of capital. It's great to do things the one-off, like in the late 90s, you can do things in a small market like, I'm going to pick on Lithuania or Latvia. Those are small and you felt like the institutional capital couldn't stay there long enough because the markets are small enough. But if you want to buy industrial there, it could have been at a 15% return when the rest of Europe was like an 8% return. But you're not sure if you can get out. You're not sure who the buyer is going to be. If there's a market shock in the capital markets or the economy in sort of Central and Eastern Europe, the market dries up and you're stuck in, and your 15% return gets eroded on the way out and you made a 6 and you're like, okay, that was a really weird round trip. So I think that's the key, is that there's no question, not just real estate private equity, but private equity, the flows, they can come with bad things because they can come with the raiders of the Lost Ark and people coming in just to manipulate business. But we all know those worries from the 80s and 90s and 2000s that, some people can come in and do the wrong things. But if you want the health and prosperity of your people and locales, you've got to find a way to be more receptive to international foreign capital on a regular basis. It doesn't have to be all the time, and it doesn't have to be without rules. But if they're arbitrary and they're punitive, then people like me are just going to redline it and go, yeah, not going to do it. Can't trust it. Can't get out. Because effectively, we represent institutional capital. We represent pension funds. Like our capital, some of them will climb the risk profile to do things that are higher risk and higher return. But generally, they want us not to come home with the bag empty. They're not asking us, and they don't allow us to swing for the fences and come back with zeros and negatives, right? Like they're investing with us, and the part of the portfolio they do, they want a reasonable return for reasonable risk. That's what our client base is. So I can't just go in and go, God, I could make a 40 or I could make a negative 20. Like that's not what they use another piece of their portfolio to make those bets.
And I think that's really interesting insights into kind of national policy as it relates to creating a favorable investment environment. But I guess sort of looking at the UK, which obviously sort of at the national level sort of has one general kind of ecosystem, but there's great disparities in wealth across the UK. And sort of from successive governments, there's been a focusing on level up. What could UK policymakers profitably take from the real estate investment community about revitalizing communities outside of London, and what kind of public investments, policy focus could be most meaningful?
Well, you're very polite to ask the sort of local question. I sit on the board of one of the UK's largest insurance companies, Legal & General, and it's been very, very heavily invested in leveling up and leveling communities, making investments with long-term capital into areas all around the UK that's going to improve the local markets, but also help improve economic activity there. So very vested in that. But the part you skipped over that I can't ignore is so if you had the playbook of exactly what not to do to invite in institutional capital, the UK's done most of it in the last few years. Whatever the reasons were, whatever your nationalist leanings were, Brexit has been an abomination for sort of the flow of talent and capital to the country. Then we've had some budget issues, we've had some leadership issues, and I don't think it's permanent. But when I talk to institutional investors around the world, and not necessarily ours, because I think sometimes real estate gets I can still see how you make local money and I can trust you there. But if you just talk about institutional capital, I don't want to drag Legal & General in there, but if you just think about who believes in that and the products or Legal & General's stock, the UK's not become uninvestable, but it's become so much closer to uninvestable to outside capital. They're not sure what they get here. They're not sure what the country's competitive advantage as a nation is. It used to be, I used to say, great education base. It still is in places, but not necessarily the leading in the world where it was for a long time. I think the things that it really competes best with is that the rule of law, if you invest here, it can't be taken away from you. It speaks English, which right now is still the language of commerce around the world. And it used to be, this was the crossroads of global talent. People, whether you've lived here for 2 years or 25 years, you came here, that part we've almost crushed and made disappear, from tax law to Brexit policy, etc. So before we get to sort of leveling up, we got to get to a place where institutional capital comes in and says, yeah, I actually want to take a bet on this UK institution, this UK strategy. I'm sure it'll change, but we are right now at the nadir, I think.
I agree with you. I mean, I guess where my views of sort of why it would not be sort of catastrophic for UK capital markets is because of some of the pre-existing items that you mentioned, and also its status at the time as sort of the most liquid capital pool in obviously a very sort of affluent region. And obviously there was going to be diminution of that via Brexit and because of the tensions with cross-border flows of capital and all that sort of thing. But I had thought, and it'd be good to get your views on this, is that the kind of the existing advantageous starting base would sort of keep up its momentum and that there wouldn't be a competing capital market center elsewhere in Europe. And so as a result, like over time, some of what had flowed out of the UK would flow back in. Is that something that you would agree with, or is that being too optimistic?
I hope so. But I mean, I think people are starting to lose faith that like whatever it is, that combination of rule of law and tax, fairness and all of that stuff is at least neutral to an advantage. I don't think that anyone saying, oh my God, Paris, or at times it was thought Dubai or Moscow was going to replace London as the capital center of sort of greater Europe or Eurasia. I think maybe it was, there was other times where Asian markets were thought that that's where it all go. I mean, it's almost worse than that because no one thinks it's replacing it. They're just going, actually, I just don't want you. I don't want someone else. I just don't want you. That's the worst thing, right? Like, I mean, I don't want to extend the analogy so far, but a partner breaks up with you and they're going with someone else. It might be devastating, but you're like, okay, at least I know what had happened. It's like, no, you're just leaving. It's not to be anywhere. You're just leaving me. And I don't think it's forever. What I often say to my team, and it applies to this, is like, I promise the end of the world will take care of itself. Our job is to figure out if it's not the end of the world. And I've been around long enough. This is definitely old guy talk, but like, this ain't the end of the world. I don't know how it's going to change. I don't think we're going to reverse Brexit and become part of the European Union. But at some point, the economic reality is going to cause us to find a way to compromise on some things that will be good for the market, because nobody votes for their own destruction every single day. I mean, at some point you wake up and realize, wow, this really isn't working for me and my family and my community. Who's thinking that they want to eat today? Everyone hands up? Okay, we do too. Yeah.
That's absolutely fascinating insights. And I was going to ask you about the last real estate question, but I appreciate, obviously, we're coming up to the kind of the end of the session. But I guess if just sort of a quick thought on it, reimagining commercial and retail real estate in terms of the era of hybrid working, how do you see commercial real estate adapting to that new reality?
I think that's a lot's going on. I mean, right now, if you compare the U.S. and Europe, they're very different places. So the U.S. is still struggling with working from home policy and how many people have returned to work and whether they ever want to return to work. And it's starting to have a major effect on the economic activity and viability of some communities in ways that people didn't think in San Francisco and New York. I mean, I don't want to pick on cities, but like there is kind of an economic sort of down loop that it will be really interesting to figure out, how they reinvigorate themselves. Not so much in Europe. What we see more in Europe is a bifurcation of forward and future-proofed office versus current office. And there's definitely less demand for things that don't have the amenities, don't feel like where people want to come to work, but more people are back to work. There's the compromise. Mondays and Fridays might be light, but there's still a work from home and work from work policy and practice that feels like it's becoming closer to norm. I think the economic hardship that's in the market now and advances, I think, everyone's like, I want to work from home. Like, okay, you can work from home for as much as you want because I don't need you anymore. Like once that starts to happen in places, people are like, I'll work from wherever you want. We all want that balance. And I think what COVID showed us is that actually the balance is good for us as human beings. And so we want to get there. But when someone's eating your lunch or you're not competing because it's taking too long to connect, or you've tried all the ways to sort of work around working from home, there'll always be an element of it, but it'll be a lot less than people thought. It won't be 70% work from home. So I think we are redefining office, but I think the biggest piece in Europe is about, ESG, environmentally sound, not just from a climate and environmental perspective, but like from a human health and happiness perspective. Our offices and workplaces becoming more of that, and the ones that aren't and are in the wrong locations or less that way are going to do less well. The U.S., bigger question, because I think until we get to a place where you're out of that economic activity down loop, I think some markets are going to be really, really challenged. I know a lot of sub-stories where people go, yeah, you're a big insurance company and you have your headquarters in Newark, and people are like, why do I actually want to go back to the office in Newark unless you make me? You know what I mean? Like, and it's not that like Newark's not a great place for some people and not a great place for every people, but I don't want people hating me because I was hating on Newark. But you can understand if people going like, well, I need everyone back in the New York City office, and they're coming in from different places, but to go to some of the foreign offices, and I don't know how that changes, but it is the dynamic is definitely changing. And unless economic hardship makes people go, everyone back at work, then there's some new format that's going to have to change there. So I think we're in the middle of trying to reimagine and restructure sort of what the workplace and activity places look like. Retail completely separate, right?
Yeah. You've lived in London now for over 2 decades. What would be your what's your perfect London day to kind of sell those who aren't so fortunate to live in this city what they're missing out on?
Yeah, let's look at where I am. So I'm executive chairman. I don't run the day-to-day of our business, but I'm still heavily integrated in sort of like I chair the investment committee. I still talk to key clients. I talk to, the senior team on sort of what's happening in the portfolio there. I have more flexibility than some, but I like the fact that sometimes I'm at home. I look at my schedule and it separates by hour or day or whatever. And so I move back and forth. I live close enough to make that a possibility. But I like the connection that I have when I'm in the office with people and how swiftly you can go from like, hey, where is that? Where are we on this, et cetera, rather than trying to hunt 3 or 4 people down, remotely by, on Zoom or on Teams. I've always practiced that my life, business life, personal life, and community were interchangeable. So like I'll have board meetings in our office and then I'll have a meeting at home and, and I used to be able to get out to my daughter's practices and plays and all of that stuff. And I think I've taught my world that they were interchangeable. Didn't mean I didn't work just as many hours, but it was like, segments of the day were there. And that's the way I like to work. So this idea that you're working from home, I might spend the morning on calls and video calls and work from home and then spend all afternoon in the office and then go out to dinner with a client or a prospect or a business partner or someone else. And I think that's a more humane way to do it. I understand and admitting and conveying that I probably have more flexibility at that because I'm the top of the proverbial food chain or thereabouts than you would if you're junior, and than I did when I was more junior.
In terms of fun, like in terms of like on a weekend, like what would be your perfect sort of kind of London weekend?
Yeah, the great part about London is everything. So I really love music. I love sports. So, I have access to every sporting event here, and I've become friends with a lot of, the players and the former players, et cetera. So I'm a little spoiled, and then I get to do a lot of that stuff. I'm off to New York right now for 2 days, and I'm back, and then I'm at the England versus Wales game for rugby on Saturday, sitting up and, with the chairman, and on Sunday, I'm meeting some friends for lunch, and then I think I'm going to go to a music venue that's right here, like, the West End. Like everything's here.
I absolutely love it as a city, and it's definitely become home for me as well. And all of that sounds very incredible. And so I think that's an exceptionally positive note upon which to conclude this very interesting conversation. Thanks, Ric, for taking time out of your busy schedule to share your insights. I would also encourage everyone to check out both the Odyssey Scholarship Program and the Black Heart Foundation and all of their important work. So, Ric, thanks again for participating.
My pleasure, Tom. Thank you.